Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back for day 2 of our IFLA post-conference satellite, Global and Comparative Research Design in Library and Information Sciences. I'm Steve Witt, and I'll be speaking this morning. Before I do, I'd like to thank our speakers from yesterday for a really invigorating series of presentations and great discussion on research design, research methods, and an excellent case study that really pulled together a lot of the topics and problems that scholars face as they're doing multi-site, multi-country research and mixed methods. So that was really wonderful. This morning, I'll be speaking about what happens next after you've done your research, you have your research question, you've got some data and some results that you've analyzed, and you're ready to pull it together and begin thinking about how you'll disseminate that information and how you'll present it to your colleagues and to the wider community. So as you're starting to present your work and focus on that next phase of the research, there are a few questions that you need to focus on. Let me adjust my screen for a second. And I think, some of those you should have answered in that research process, but oftentimes in the process of your research, when you go to write it up, you've kind of lost the thread of perhaps your literature review or your original research that you were looking at as you began to formulate your research question and gather data. So you need to revisit those questions and talk about and think about how you're adding to the overall literature on the topic, and make sure that that is something you're really focusing upon and highlighting as you begin writing up your research. You also have to then think about the context of your research and how that context is adding to the literature and informing the overall research that you're doing. So for example, you need to think about the regional or local context that might be the focus of your research. And then also the scope of the research. And as the previous presentations yesterday really focused upon, that scope is going to be informative as you're discussing your results and how they're applicable. And then you also need to really focus upon who you're addressing when you're writing and think about your audience. Very often, research is done out of an immediate need, especially if it's coming out of practical professional work. And so you're thinking of that immediacy, but when you're writing your work, you have to perhaps think of a broader audience. You're not necessarily writing to your supervisor from whom you'd like to get more funding, but to a wider group of scholars who will want to engage your work and try to use it for their own purposes. So as you begin writing, it's really critical to have an introduction that's going to attract the reader's attention. As you're writing up your research, you really have to think of the process as telling a story. And anytime you've told a story, sometimes your story builds. As your audience changes, your story may change. But you're always trying to improve that story as you go. And this is really the next iteration of the story, is when you're writing it up for a professional journal or international journal. So your introduction is quite critical. You're in this introduction, you have to assert the problem that you're addressing and why that problem is worthwhile to address, why it's important. You need to explain the context and scope of the research and why the intervention you've taken or what you've done is important to a wider audience. And after you write your introduction, always go back to it after you've finished writing your paper, because sometimes you don't realize the importance of what you've done until you've written everything, written your conclusion, and have kind of stepped back from your work. So always revisit the introduction and make sure you're providing that compelling narrative that's going to attract the reader's attention. And the first reader whose attention you have to attract, of course, is the editor of a journal and that peer review group. And if you don't convince them, you won't get the chance to convince others. So that's your first challenge. So here's an example of an introduction from an article that was published in IFLA Journal a number of years ago. And I think it offers a rather concise but nice display of an introduction that quickly introduces the problem, complex matrix of challenges related to education in Africa, and access to supplemental reading materials. Provides a bit more context on that problem, discusses the research that was done, and then the methodologies as well. So it's in a very concise format, has presented in a way the full research, but not to the extent that it would prove a point or exhaust the results, but it does give you the introduction, so you know what's coming. And the reader needs to know what's coming in the paper so that they're prepared to analyze and learn from it. The next piece that you need to really focus upon is the review of the literature. And you'll see that review of the literature exists not just in the literature review section of the paper, but you'll note in this introduction, there are citations to the literature that are helping to prove the point of the importance of the topic and what other research has been done. But you have to then look at that. So the first question is, why is the literature review important to getting your work published? And there's quite a number of reasons to that. First, that literature review connects your work to a wider conversation on a topic. So when you're writing a paper, you're really choosing to join a conversation, an academic debate on something. So the literature review is in conversation with the previous literature. So you need to explain in that literature review what you're adding, what gaps you're filling, make that evident to the reader. It also establishes your authority on the topic, and kind of your credentials for joining this conversation. So if you're missing important works, the reviewers will wonder, why isn't that there? They'll comment upon it. If your sources are out of date in that literature review, they'll wonder whether or not you're missing work, or maybe they'll think you're working on a topic that is quite stale and not of interest to anybody anymore. So you need to make sure that's up to date. And I think many scholars, especially people beginning the research journey, often are scared when they find a paper that's very similar to what they've done, or what they would like to do. And either they'll say, well, I'm not going to do that research because someone else did it, or they're going to try to ignore that research and do theirs without mentioning it. And both of those are problematic. So if there's something quite similar to what you've done, you need to have that in your literature review, and you need to show what you're doing as distinct from that. Or if you're replicating that research, why is your context going to add to it? Or why is it important to try to replicate this? But don't ignore that. And also, finding similar research means you're on the right track. You have a community of scholars who are doing similar work that you're trying to join. So those are the people with whom you're trying to have a conversation. So as you're doing the literature review, a few tips. Remember, if you're telling a story, always keep that in mind. And as we've talked about yesterday, do your literature review before you start your research. This is how you're going to determine what you're adding to the research. This is how you're going to decide what methodologies might be appropriate. This is where you're going to find whether someone's done a survey exactly like the survey you wanted to do, and you can then borrow theirs or build upon it. Also, don't just look at the main topic in your literature review. Make sure that that review of literature will include some discussion of the research methods that people are using, and the research subjects, how those subjects were identified, how the scope was outlined. And also, as you're thinking of submitting to a journal, look at that literature review and see which journals am I citing a lot, because that's going to be an indication of where the appropriate journals to submit might be. So if you look at your literature review and the journal you plan to submit to isn't in there, then that's an indication that either you shouldn't submit to that journal, or you need to look at that journal to see what they've done in that area and make sure it's in the review. And also with the literature review, very often a journal editor will look at that review and bibliography and use it as a way in which to identify potential reviewers for your work. So it's important that that is fairly comprehensive, so that you and that you understand that some of those people may review it. So in your literature review, if you're overly critical, that could come back, if you can't back that up. The next section then is the methods. This is an area in the peer review process that very often determines whether or not your work is going to be accepted. If the methods isn't justifiable, the reviewers are going to be skeptical of the rest of the work. So you need to justify why you chose what you chose, why you did a survey, why you did interviews, and not only why, but what type of survey you did, what type of interview method, and which scholars you're drawing upon for those methods. So very often in IFLA Journal, I'll get an article that says, we did a survey and we selected 100 students from this university. That's it, method. Okay, it is the method, but it doesn't say why you did the survey. It doesn't cite research on how to conduct surveys. It doesn't talk about why you chose those subjects. So you need to make sure that that is done. So within the methods, there's really another form of literature review that you need to include that is discussing the choices you made. So here's an example from another paper from 2018 that talks about a mixed methods approach. So you take a moment to look at this, you'll see that they talk about this being chosen as the most appropriate method. It discusses the value of qualitative versus quantitative research and the benefits of each. And then while ultimately they made their choices. You see their citations for different scholars that have used these methods and why they're an appropriate choice for that paper. And it talks about the value of those methods, but even where those methods may fall short and the drawbacks of one or the other. So that's an important aspect to develop in your paper. And very often people don't do that. And if they don't, they'll either be asked to add it by the reviewers, or the reviewers may just say, reject your work. Next, when we're talking about results, this is another area where people start looking at their data, start analyzing the results, and sometimes they forget what their original research question was, or they're not exactly addressing that question. So make sure as you're writing your results, it's grounded upon what you were trying to study and what your questions were and what other people have done in the past in that area. So you have to make sure that you're also grounded in how you got your results. What kind of evidence do you have? If you're not doing a generalizable study, as Peter Laura was talking about in the chart yesterday, where you had the case study going to the more generalizable work. If you're not doing that more generalizable work, then don't generalize your results. Don't make statements that would seem to claim that you're making something a universal claim or predicting the behavior of somebody or an outcome. You can only talk about what you know by the evidence. So that's often something that gets criticized by reviewers. Don't forget, as I said, to answer your research question. And also don't forget about any broader theoretical perspectives that you're taking and what questions have been addressed in the literature review. So the results are still part of that conversation. So you need to draw back on literature review. Are you confirming what somebody found? Did you find something that goes against trends in the literature? Is your context somehow important in relationship to the results? And that's important to include. And then another tip is if you're doing data that creates tables and charts, make sure to discuss those results and their significance, refer to the chart, refer to the data, but you should have a substantive discussion and a long narrative. Very often we'll get pages and pages of charts and a couple sentences that describe that, and nobody wants to see that. It's hard to understand and interpret. So you need to, the chart really backs up what you're saying as opposed to saying what you want on your behalf. So make sure to use tables and charts appropriately. And then as you write your conclusion, take a break. Don't do it when you're exhausted or think that you're done, because usually people kind of run out of energy in the conclusion. They've gotten bored of their topic by now. They just want to be done. So make sure that you spend good time on the conclusion. Sometimes that's the only thing people will read when they're looking at, they'll read your abstract, maybe skim it and look at your conclusion to see what you found. So that's important. So you need to re-summarize your research and findings. You need to add information that's going to help the reader see the implications of your work and your research. And this is something that reviewers often ask people to expand upon in their revisions. So when you do your conclusion, here's some things you should make sure that you accomplish. Explain where your research has fallen short of your goals. You're never done. As we talked yesterday, you're always going to find more things you can research, more questions, more further investigation. And nobody's research is ever so perfect that they hit their goals and they're done with the topic. So you need to admit, this is where we fell short. This is where it could have been better. This is where we don't have full clarity. And then that leads to where further research can be done on the topic. Again, you're in a conversation. So you're talking about your research and you're trying to inspire other people to follow your lead and continue work in this area. So there's always a sequel to your story. There should be something that's moving towards rather than just finished. And then it's also important in that conclusion to once again place the research in that wider context. You've done it in your introduction. You need to do it again in the conclusion. And this is your opportunity to show that if you're focused on something at your institution or in a regional application, you can show how it has broader relevance, how it's linked to other social, cultural, economic phenomena that may be informing what you're doing. So make sure that if it is driven by other forces, globalization, socio-technical infrastructures, marketplace demands for certain skills, that you're talking about this. That's going to add to the interest of your work. It's going to make your work relevant to people in other disciplines, in social sciences, and they'll see how libraries are responding to social change, social situations, disruptions. Remember, nothing exists in isolation. So even when you're discussing a single case, you need to relate it to these other scenarios. Things to try not to do in your conclusion. Try not to focus on recommendations and conclusions that only have some significance for yourself or your institution. Sometimes the conclusion sounds like it's written to somebody's supervisor or funding agency, and the only reason they did that research is to prove that they need new computers, prove that they need a more robust training program, or prove that their supervisor was wrong about something. Don't use your research to do that. And it's not going to have much in terms of broader relevance. Reapply your theoretical frame to make it interesting and relevant. That should be in the do's, sorry. And then also in the don'ts, as I mentioned, make sure you're not writing to your stakeholders or your boss, you're writing to your broader audience. So here's an example of a conclusion that does take into account these broader factors. It talks about the earlier research that's been done on the topic, reevaluates what they were trying to examine, talks about how the findings are consistent with other research, and continues that conversation. So once you've done all these things and you've written your draft and you're getting ready to submit, then you're still only partway through the process. So at this point, it's time to try to prepare your manuscript for that peer review process. So as I mentioned before, you need to find the journals you want to submit to. And remember, only submit to one journal at a time. Don't send multiple copies out. That's frowned upon, and the editors will find out from one another generally. So make sure you look at your manuscript submission guidelines, follow the referencing style, make sure your citations are done correctly, you're within the word limit, and make sure you have a good title, abstract, and keywords. These are quite important. Always proofread your abstract and your title. You'd be amazed how many times a title and abstract have simple errors that could have been caught immediately, but people are in a hurry. They want to get it submitted. So make sure to review that. So as I mentioned, as you review this, think about the people that are going to be reading this first. That's usually the editor of the journal, and then if you're lucky, the reviewers will see it. So make sure that your abstract covers the work well. Make sure that you have good keywords and your references are formatted. So the title should be descriptive and engaging. So it should summarize the article's contents, should contain any relevant technical terms related to your research. And unless the article is specifically about an institution, a region, or country, there's little need to identify that location in the title. Then for the abstract, this is often the first thing the editor will read, often the first thing anybody will read of your article. So make sure that you're describing the problem setting, the study, the experimental design, and any conclusions that you found. So it's basically a mini version of your whole paper. So it should have all of those elements in it, in about 150 words. So it's often very hard to compress that enough, so it takes a lot of time and care actually to write a good abstract. Another thing that people often do at the last moment of submission is write their keywords. And I would suggest try to think of your keywords as you're writing your paper and as you're doing your research even. And you probably have keywords that you've been doing with your literature review. So those are probably some of the keywords you want in your paper. So look at other papers that you think you're like and use the same keywords. Remember, joining a conversation. Make sure the keywords fit within your journal's scope and their field of research. And then also make sure that you're using those words throughout your paper. And if you're not, then maybe they're not your keywords, but you will get higher results in search engines and databases if the keywords are in the paper, in your abstract, and are the keywords. So the algorithms kind of pick those up and push you up. And then finally, more practically in the review process, sometimes those keywords are used by the journal submission management system to identify reviewers. So in the system that we use with Sage, I can pick that keyword and it'll pull up the reviewers in the database that match the keyword. And that's sometimes one of the first things I'll do when I'm looking for a reviewer. So that's also important in the review process. Okay, so you've done all that. Now your paper is going to peer review. So you submit it and you're done. You think you're happy. And I get an email as the editor that says, someone submitted an article, and that prompts me to log in and take a look. So make sure before you've done that, that you've obtained permission for any copyrighted materials, that you have acknowledged funding, conflicts of interest, you haven't plagiarized, and that you're able to abide by the journal's contributors publishing agreement. So you understand the copyright implications of your submission. Are you submitting to an open access journal? Is it a hybrid open access, etc. These, in the first review of your paper, these are the first things that are considered. Are the images in that appropriate? Are there some acknowledgement of rights for those? Is it formatted? Is it within the right scope? So once you've submitted your paper, it goes through review. And as you can see, that review process can be somewhat circular. So you'll either be asked to revise your paper. Sometimes people get an accept without changes. Has that happened to anybody here when you've done? A couple people, okay, good for you. It's never happened to me. But you know, usually there's going to be something they want you to change. One time, yeah, that's all, that's good. So you need to be prepared to revise your paper. And you need to think of this as a great opportunity. You get two experts who are going to look at your paper and give you detailed advice for free. You didn't have to pay them. They don't get paid. They're volunteering to do it. What a great system, right? So think of it as an opportunity to get feedback, even if you don't like what they have to say. But it's going to help improve your work. You'll either get an accept without change, you'll get a revise and resubmit, or accept with minor changes. Most times you'll get a revise and resubmit. That's usually for papers that require really more than a day's work for improving it. It may be you have to go back and explain your methodology, maybe that your results weren't presented properly. But it's something that's a little bit more significant. If it's except with minor revisions. When I'm making that choice as an editor, it's usually, if I think, okay, I could do that in an afternoon, it's not going to take long, and the paper looks pretty good. So when you get that feedback, listen to the reviewers, make sure to read all the comments, and then also note the timeframes that are requested. Usually you'll have 30 days to provide, or 60 days, depending on the journal, to provide your revision. And then you'll need to address the referees point by point. Don't ignore anything the referee says. Most journals will send that paper back to the same people that reviewed it. And they're going to look to see, did they do what I asked? What was their response? And if you've ignored them, they're probably going to select reject, because they'll be irritated with you. And I get emails from reviewers all the time saying, I can't believe these people didn't even do any of these changes. So they'll put in a review that goes to the authors, and there's also a section that goes to the editor. And usually the section with the editor is where they complain about what the author didn't do. So address those points. And it could be, and it go back and forth several times. It's not uncommon, at least for IFLA Journal, that it's 2 or 3 iterations of revise and resubmit, which means it takes months and months and months for your paper to be approved. So you have to be patient and try to be positive. So when you respond to your reviewer, try to do it formally, collegially. Dear editor and reviewers, thank you for carefully reading my manuscript. Be positive and discuss how you've addressed their concerns. And provide a detailed account of how you've addressed those. These little things matter. The reviewer sees that, they're put in a little bit better mood, paper with the rosier eyeglasses. So I think the best method I've seen for responding to reviewers is to put it in some form of tabular format. And oftentimes the author will create a table, they'll put each comment in that table, maybe they'll label it reviewer 1, reviewer 2, etc. And then they'll have their commentary on that, their rejoinder. So what they did. And they may agree and say, thank you, I've done this, I think it's better now. They may disagree. It's okay to disagree with the reviewers. They're just another person with their own opinion, and maybe they didn't understand what you said. So very often, if the reviewer doesn't agree with you, it could mean either your research is flawed, you were wrong in some way or mistaken, or the reviewer didn't understand what you said. So you maybe need to revise your language so that it's more clear. But you get to respond to that reviewer and say, dear reviewer, thank you for this comment, but this is what I meant to say. This is why I think it needs to stay in the paper. This is why maybe you need to cite some other literature or something else to assert your point. And most of the time the reviewer will say, yeah, I guess you're right. And they'll let it go. If they don't agree, they'll come back with some further commentary, but it's okay to, I wouldn't say argue, but assert your opinion, assert your point in that review process. That's part of the conversation you're having, and this is the first opportunity to do that. And then you need to then get ready for a rejection. Unfortunately, in academic journals, most of the rejection rates are around 60, 65%. For IFLA Journal, I think our last editor's report, we were, I think, 30% acceptance rate. So, you know, if you're submitting 10 papers, only 3 are going to be accepted. That's, you know, so I guess it's more like American baseball. You know, you're a very good batter if you get a hit 3 times out of 10, right? So journals are the same way. So as you get those rejections, don't just delete the email and get mad. Look at the reviewer's report, what they said. They should be giving you some advice on how to improve your work. Focus on that advice and then rework your paper. Go back and redo your research if you have to, or edit it, and then submit it to another journal. And the process starts again. But very often I'll get a paper that, you know, is very well polished and it's, you know, well done. And I suspect it's already gone through a review process because it may go through the review in the journal much quicker because things have been worked out through that. So always consider returning to it and going to another journal. Don't just give up. And then going back to those journals, you know, make sure as you're going through the process that you are looking at, you know, very critically which journals you want to submit to. So read their aims and scope, think about their readership, look at their impact factor if that's important for you. Some people have tenure decisions that are, you know, derived from the impact factor of their publications or the journals they publish in. But I think it's really important also to look at the editorial board of that journal. Do you know anybody on the board? Do you recognize their institutions? Do you know their research? Look at some of the research of people on that board. Look at the research that you've seen in that journal to make sure it matches. And also take a look at their speed to publication. That should be listed somewhere in different reports on the journal. Often the paper should say this was submitted, you know, October 2018, published, you know, November 2022 or something. So you can see, okay, this one took 4 years. Maybe I don't have 4 years. I've got to go up for tenure in 1 year. I'll try a journal that has a quicker turnaround time. So look at that and talk to your colleagues. They're probably the best source for this kind of advice because they've probably dealt with some of the journals and their editors. And that concludes what I've got to say about putting your work together. I hope this is helpful, and we've got time for questions, I think. So if anyone has a question, please feel free.
May I make a comment?
Sure.
The speed of publication can be a trap, because when it comes to predatory journals, that's one of their great attractions. So if you see we will publish your work within 2 weeks, then you must know it's too good to be true. And if it's too good to be true, it's not true.
Yes.
And then you're on the wrong, publishing in the wrong journal. And I mention this because in developing countries, people are not always aware of this. Young scholars are under great pressure to publish, and so they fall for this kind of scheme.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that. There's also some companies that will promise to guide you through the peer review and submission process, and they're typically not legitimate either. So they're either putting them through these predatory journals or making promises that they don't deliver on. But they claim that they can guarantee positive reviews or guarantee certain reviewers, and that's not the case, and the publishers are quite aware of these things that are happening.
At one point, when you were talking a little bit about thinking about audience, you had mentioned time as a factor, and I don't think that you were talking about this, but it did make me think about it. So I'm going to ask the question anyway. So when you're considering an audience, you know, when I've published, I'm always just kind of thinking about like, did a thing, get it out there, but do folks think about audience not only in terms of the here and now, but also like your audience through time when you're writing? Like, is that something that authors are considering or should be considering, or like other than just where it fits in the next step in the conversation?
I think you need to be considering that in some sense, in terms of the audience should be broader than peer reviewers or, you know, your immediate colleagues, but that scholarly network you're tapping into. So we kind of think of that audience as the other authors of the, you know, that you're citing in the Lit review, for example, or the people that are doing that kind of work. So if it's and if it's more practical research you're reporting that you think people will then use to change, you know, their policies or their services, then you need to think about those colleagues at those other institutions and how they would apply your work. So and some people may just think of their advisor or somebody like that, or a mentor, as you know, that they know is part of that community. And if it's going to read well to them, then it should read well more general.
I guess I'm wondering about thinking about the life of a manuscript in terms of like, I guess I think of it as having a very short life, you know, like it gets published, some folks are gonna be interested in it for a couple of years and then it's done. But I don't necessarily, when I'm writing something, think about like that extended life of the works. I'm wondering if people, maybe I'm wondering if people do that.
I was going to ask you, because what I've read, and others may, is that it takes like 7 to 10 years for an idea, a theory to be adopted in the social sciences. And what I found is papers we've written, the ones that have really, like, people have accepted the frameworks, the theories, it has been about 10 years. Is that where you see that pickup? Is that?
I suspect that's, yeah, because I think of my own publications and, you know, the ones that continue to be cited, you know, they're ending up in literature reviews or so that, but it takes several years for that to even start to occur. And library science is not biomedical science where the half-life of that research is about 15 minutes. You know, we're talking about things that are, I think, a bit more enduring, and not, you know, we're not having immediate effect on the field. So I think there's both much fewer readers of the literature than many other disciplines, but it's also some of these things take longer. So I think you should think about that. And I think journal editors are often thinking of that as well, as, you know, will this be the type of work that will be in someone's literature review in 10 years or so? Then they're more likely to want it in their journal, because that, you know, they're concerned about not only short-term impact, but the enduring impact of their journals.
Can I ask you about, so you submit a paper, it does get accepted, you know, it gets published, and then obviously the copyright is kind of with the publisher, depending on what agreement you signed. So my question is more about if you've had some findings that obviously you've shared in a professional journal, but actually are relevant to practitioners, and you know that the chances are they might not be reading that journal, they might be reading, for example, I'm thinking of school librarians, they might be reading School Library Professional, whatever, you know, just what comes through the mail each month. So then how free are you to then write your findings up in a different way that is really accessible to a practitioner? So I'm thinking what you're saying of like longevity, but actually to narrow that gap, putting the findings also in a practitioner journal, like how free are you to do that if it's the copyright of the publisher?
You're quite free to do it because those are your ideas and it's your work. So you can't take that article and give it to, you know, put it on a blog or send it to that journal, but you can take those ideas and rewrite them in a way that is maybe more broadly written for an audience, or maybe only taking the results and the conclusions and rewriting those in a way that's more actionable. But yes, they changed the title, and I mean there used to be the 30% number used to be thrown around, that the work has to have a different title and be changed by 30% to be published in another venue. The publishers don't like to use that number anymore, but they, you know, but that's, you have to be presenting it in a different way, with different words, for the most part. But you can, I've, you know, in my own research, you know, I'm often talking about the same thing over and over again, and I feel like didn't I publish this before? And I think, well, no, I was using a different theory and exploring it in a different way, and that's okay. And then also, I think journal editors are actually going to be thrilled if you're doing that, especially if you're citing yourself while doing it, because they're trying to disseminate how impact factors include things like, you know, mentions in Mendeley and, you know, tweets and blog postings and usage by the media. So if you turn around and write that in something that's more of a news, then that would increase that, you know, their impact metrics. So that's okay. And you can always confirm with it, but as long as you're changing it enough that it's not the same thing, then it's fine.
Steve, I wanted to ask you about your opinion about writing abstracts, and I absolutely agree how important they are, titles and abstracts and keywords, because with the amount that's being published, we are not reading everything. Sometimes that's the first step of making a decision, whether I'm going to read it, include in the readings for my students, or even as a reviewer. Often that's how we make a decision. We read the title, we read an abstract, and we make a decision whether we are going to review or not. But I wanted to ask about something different, about writing abstracts for the global audience. You know, since we are talking about global research here, you know, there are some suggestions, since English is really a dominant language of scholarly communication, and that probably is not going to change, you know. So researchers and students in other countries often use machine translation, automatic translation, to translate articles into the languages that they read. You know, there are some suggestions that we should be writing in a way that the, you know, articles are sort of suitable for machine translation. Not sure would I agree whether the entire article should be written at a 6th grade level, you know, because obviously that has a lot of restrictions. But what are your thoughts about writing abstracts, simple sentences, you know, the way that it could be actually accessible and we get a decent machine translation?
Yeah, I think I would agree. That the abstract needs to be very direct and concise which lends itself more to simple sentences. If you have many clauses and prepositional phrases and complexity, then you're using half of your words on one sentence, one bit of what you're trying to impart. So I think the simple phrases and as little jargon as you can get away with, there's some theoretical terms you may have to use to show what grounding you have or perspective. But I think the more direct and clear, the better for the abstract. And for IFLA Journal, we translate the abstracts into the IFLA languages, and other IFLA bodies sometimes translate those as well and distribute them within their countries or affiliate organizations. So I think that's an important piece. You don't want someone to have to figure out what you're trying to say in the abstract. They should be able to just look at it almost as a block and absorb it in a way.
Are there any journals that take practitioners on sort of like a little internship or something, so that practitioners can see behind the scenes of the peer review process? Have you ever heard of any schemes like that?
No, I haven't. Be an interesting thing to do. We've done a lot of webinars and presentations that kind of try to go behind the scenes in the peer review process. We did a series of them over the last 2 years that talked a lot about that. Egbert participated in those. And I think those were helpful just so that it demystifies it, kind of takes it out of that black box so that people understand what's happening. But having them actually observe could
Or
have
even
some
like
ethical problems.
like a mini reviewer, so that they can start to compare their reading of something with an experienced
Yeah.
readers of something,
Yeah, and some journals will do that as their onboarding editors, kind of try to get consistency in the editors and the reviews and share those, but that could be quite helpful.
Kind of going along with the practitioner side. So as an academic librarian, somewhere between 10 and 20% of my time is research, but the majority of what I'm doing is practice. So I have kind of 2 questions related to that are kind of related. One is more about methodology. So a lot of what has been in my own writing done so far is the How We Done It Good articles. So my question first is, are all How We Done It Good articles case studies? Or could they be classified in other ways? That's my first question. And then if you're working off of just what you're doing as a practitioner, I don't know if this is even totally possible, but how do you then work with or deal with a lack of literature if you're doing something kind of new in terms of a program or a practice where maybe there's not a lot of folks who've done that same thing?
Okay, so for the first question, how I Done It Good always a case study? I'd say no, but it depends on, are you aware while you're doing it that you're going to be doing research on that topic? And I think that's where the practitioner research, trajectory often breaks down, because people may do a project, they may have something that they've done and it's quite successful, but they haven't done any research on it or thought about publishing about it until after the fact. So in that case, you have a case study, but it's really not informed by any methodology other than an analysis, it's almost like a historical piece at that point because it's done. So those are harder to get published. So I think what has to happen is practitioners need to be aware that they may publish their work as they're starting projects, so that they're working with their research review board and have those approvals before they start the project, because if you don't have that approved, you can't talk to anybody about it and gather that data, whether it be an interview or a survey. So any of that work that you may have done, you can't use in your research because you didn't get approval beforehand. And there's really not ex post facto review approval on your data that has to be gathered with that approval in hand. So that's the first problem. The second is, if you're not aware that you're doing research on the project, you're not gathering that data, keeping the notes, and sequencing things in a way that will yield any kind of evidence that you're working with, or a methodology that's consistent throughout. So I think, you need to be aware that I'm going to be doing research on this and I have to sequence things and maybe slow it down in a way rather than let's go try this and do it, so you have to be self-aware, I think. And there's quite a few methodologies, especially in the fields of education, social work, where you have, not exactly action research, but it's similar to action research where the researcher is a participant in that project. And adopting some of those methods, I think, would be helpful in that sense, because you're pointing to other fields that have been successful in doing practitioner-based research. The second question was,
Well, I guess that kind of informs that second question then. So if people are kind of not coming at it with the idea of research and are trying to publish later on, I'm wondering about like a lack of, how do you deal with lacks of specific literature in a certain area, like when you're trying, maybe that's exciting that you've amazingly found something that nobody else has found, which is never happened. But how far is it possible as an editor to stretch those connections with literature, around something that not very many people have really.
I'd be surprised if there's any question someone's working on that no one's done before. So it may be a difference of what your intervention was, or what your program was, or what your new service was, maybe is novel and nobody's done it before and done research on that thing, let's say AI reference service or something like that. Well, that's still addressing a similar problem. How do we address information needs of patrons? How do we work at a scale broader than we're able to, or work 24/7 under circumstances of scarce resources? So it's going to be connected to some problem in the field, and you need to connect it to that problem. So that's where the research question becomes critical, because it's not necessarily the program or project that you're linking in the literature. It's that research question, or that social need that's being filled, or that economic need that society has. That's what you're linking to. And there's always literature on that, maybe not in library science, but education, sociology, computer science, if you're looking at AI, or business, is often ahead of libraries in unfortunately, libraries increasingly adopt business type models for their work. So it's just a matter of linking it to that research question and making sure that question has some relevance to a broader academic community. Does that answer?
Yeah. I think just touching on that is the point I'd like to make, that when people are writing papers, they should be aware of the possible conceptual framework which is relevant to their work. Because if you want to link, if you want to make a contribution to the literature, then your conceptual framework should be also related to what's actually happening in the literature. In addition to which, there's a huge amount of useful conceptual work done in other fields, business, what have you, which can throw a lot of light on what we're doing. My problem with many articles in library science and information science, it's done out of a sort of a naive empiricism, you know, it's there, and so that's it, without any kind of theoretical background or thought even about what it is we're studying. We just accept at face value whatever we are seeing. And so a lot of what is produced is isolated. It doesn't really fit into any kind of pattern. We would be making a greater contribution if we could pay more attention to the theoretical or conceptual framework of what we're doing and in what field we are working.
Yeah, I agree. And that's often the downfall of papers, where it's, we found that, 20% of scholars in, context X use repositories. And that's it.
So what?
Who cares? That's great for your scholars and your institution to know, but why does anybody else need to know that?
That's the so what question. Very important.
Steve, I wanted to ask about peer review. You were, sharing advice about staying positive as an author, which is, I think, important understanding. Are there similar guidelines for peer reviewers? Overall, my experience has been very positive, and I value it and I learn from it. But occasionally you get a review that the tone is kind of scary, and are there any guidelines for reviewers to keep that tone positive? After all, it's a communication between authors and reviewers.
Yeah.
And a second part of my question is, do you see differences in how peer review is conducted by reviewers who are, more international, coming from other countries?
For the first question, I think there's some guidance. I think for IFLA Journal, we try to, the guidance is more of, we try to take a more mentorship stance in the review process. So to make sure that even if it's highly critical, it's trying to be informative and improve someone's research and maybe give them more chances to revise or, resubmit it in another format or what have you. So we take that stance. I think it's usually, journal by journal, but there's also an organization called COPE, which I can't remember the acronym, Council of Publishing Ethics or something like that. And they offer a lot of advice on the peer review process. And they do a fair amount of research, based on the review process and based on perceptions of editors in terms of what are the concerns in that peer review process. So for example, they've done some research that shows that language, English as the dominant language is, quite concerning in that, and how to accommodate people from other linguistic, traditions to publish in English, and how to make that process more accessible. But so there's organizations like that editors get emails from, whether they look at that stuff or not, I don't know. I tend to pay attention to it. Then for the international reviewers, that does become an issue because and I think we've kind of alluded to this yesterday, different, and as your research shows, different places have varying emphases on types of methodologies, and the survey dominates, which is kind of suggesting a more positivist approach to research. So sometimes reviewers from that kind of tradition will look at a case study or a more qualitative research and not see any value at all in it because they're assessing it for the value you would assess survey research or something more quantitative, moving more in that spectrum towards generalizable knowledge or replicability or something. So that can be an issue. It's really up to the journal editor to pick the appropriate reviewer so I have some reviewers that are my qualitative people and they get the qualitative stuff. I get some that are statistics, so they get some people that know scientometrics, so they get those papers. So it's really up to the editor to make sure there's a fit. And then it's up to the editor to look at the review, and if the reviewers got it wrong, to respond accordingly to the author, just so that they, let's say that reviewer rejects it, but another reviewer doesn't, then it's the editor makes that choice, and then can provide the advice on how to respond to the reviewers.
I was once banned by a reviewer from a country in the global south for using the first person in my article. And clearly that person was still kind of a decade or two behind the current trend. Today we regard these conventions about doing everything in the second or in the third person as being outdated, and in fact a form of obfuscation or a way of making science look more objective than science actually is. So today we don't insist on that anymore, but sometimes you find reviewers who don't really engage much with the content, but they sort of engage with all, because of maybe they can't engage more with sort of externalities.
Yeah.
And then you must not get despondent when you get an answer like that. I answered by giving a little lecture about how, how science, I'm looking for the word, obfuscation mystification. There's a mystification. Professions tend to use mystifications to separate themselves from the real world where ordinary people live. And using the first person and all those kinds of conventions gives the impression that the research is being carried out entirely objectivity without any human intervention,
right,
which is not the case.
Yeah, and that's kind of that positivist approach versus qualitative. And, in the qualitative, the researcher exists in that, and that's acknowledged as a limitation in building knowledge, so that it has to be acknowledged and described in some way.
But in positivist research, it's also the researcher also exists. It's just not mentioned.
Not mentioned formally, yeah.
Do you want to ask the audience online if they
Yeah. Are there any online questions? I guess I can.
haven't seen any, but this is an opportunity for them.
There's none in the QA. So if anybody in the audience in the online virtual audience has a question, please feel free to submit it in the Q&A function. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me directly by email as well. Going once. I'd like to thank everybody. It's really a nice discussion and conversation. It's good to have those questions and to think about these issues within the publishing process. So right now we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll reconvene for we have a breakout scheduled, and then a lunch break. So if we can reconvene for the breakouts, let's say at 11:30, and then we'll do the breakout session at that point. Good afternoon. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good break, got some exercise, had a meal. We are at our concluding session of this two-day meeting, and I'm pleased to bring to the podium once again Lynn Silipigni Connaway, who is going to give us a summation and where we go from here in regards to developing global and comparative LIS research design. As Lynn speaks, she would like to encourage you to ask questions and add your own thoughts to the workshop and directions we may want to go in the future. And then we will be communicating with you after the workshop with some follow-up questions and assessments as well. But please welcome Lynn, and she will finish us off here. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And I hate to be the one holding you back from the rest of your Sunday, whatever time of the day it may be. So today I've been sitting here taking notes and trying to develop a presentation. So bear with me if things don't look great or the font's not right, because I've been doing this sort of on the fly. But I was trying to pick up on some things that we talked about or things I heard. I really, you saw this yesterday. Research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose. And purpose is key here. And Peter said something today that hit me. Somebody said something and he said, so what? And it's that so what question. And that comes up a lot. And so I've done a lot of things and people have said to me, so what? What's new? What did you learn? And then I thought, well, I thought I communicated that. And I obviously did not. So always think about that so what question, because I think that is critical in everything we do. I have no idea who Carlton Hughes is. Maybe somebody else knows, but I really like this quote. This whole creative process is not a situation where you get struck by a single lightning bolt, because I think often we think, you have those aha moments, but you have ongoing discoveries and they're ongoing creative revelations. And you must allow yourself room for ideas to grow, take root. And I think whenever we often have our research plan and we're ready to go, we often miss some things that are really interesting and important. And we need to really think about that. And so I thought of this. So you follow the itinerary or the map, but you take detours. And a friend once told me that about my cooking. She said, and I don't know if that was a good or a bad thing, but she said, Lynn, you'll have a recipe, but you always take detours. And so then when I ask you, how did you do this? You're like, I don't know. I just added this or that or removed this. So if you do take a detour, what I would like you to do is document. And I can't stress that enough. We are on a very large grant project now with 3 different institutions doing 3 different things and trying to pull it all together. And I just keep saying to everyone, document. No matter what we do, no matter what, if we're on the path, if we're on that itinerary and haven't detoured, document. When we do detour, document more. Because we won't remember. And if people want to replicate this, and we may be the people, we need to remember what we've done. And you need to be able to explain this to your colleagues, your peers, and also to any funding agencies. And when you're ready to disseminate the information, you also need to be able to say, this is what we did, and not just what we did, but why. So I encourage you to take detours, but you do need to document. And so I start thinking about the itinerary and the things we've talked about. So number 1, review the literature. Narrow the topic. You know a lot. And if you're doing some type of action research, you need to document what you know about your library, your institution, your users. And so do not reinvent the wheel. Take what you know from others in the literature and from what you know from your institution, library, users, and use that to your advantage. Build on that. Where are the gaps? Narrow the topic. And I keep thinking of Egbert when he said, keep it simple. And we were talking about that. And then Christina said, it's not easy to keep it simple. No, it's not. It's not. But, you know, only the facts. Just get down to what you want to know. You'll have a lot more questions. And this came out in our discussion groups. And I can't remember who suggested it, but to put it into phases. And so if you chunk it out, it seems much more doable. And again, you're on that itinerary. So what do you want to know? Identify that purpose. Formulate the question or questions. Peter mentioned this today. You need to identify this conceptual framework if you're using one. You know, talk about that and why you're using it. You need to select, but also justify the data collection tools and that you're using. That's very important. And that came out a lot with what everyone was talking about, and especially when Steve was talking today. When you're trying to explain it to others, to disseminate this, you need to explain why, that whole justification, and the whole justification, that purpose for that research. What this was all about was considering different perspectives, cultures, and disciplines. And so it's great to be inclusive, to include other disciplines. We were talking at dinner and Christina said, yeah, we have this great faculty member who's from the social sciences. And he's so good with quantitative methods and qualitative methods. And it's really good for us. That's what we've done on our research team. If you have that opportunity and the person is a good fit for what you want to do, bring in others. You have colleagues in other departments. There may be some right in your library who have different backgrounds. We have someone in our research team at OCLC whose PhD is in agricultural economics. We have someone else who's in policy. We have someone else who is in management information systems and used to work for IBM. So it brings very different perspectives. I'm the only one right now with a PhD in library and information science. And my background, my minor was in law and public policy. So I can bring different perspectives in as they can. And I really think we have to really try to do this. The other thing is our language. And think about the questions we ask. And Peter had very good examples. I know Christina, Egbert, and Kawana wasn't here, and Debbie were talking about the differences when you're coding, the different languages. I mentioned that. These are all things that you have to consider. What's lost in translation? How we're doing interviews. I know when we were doing interviews in Spain, I had to be different. It was much more informal. It was very chatty. And so you need to think of these things. When I was doing interviews in the UK, it was different. I had to dress in a different way. I had to present myself in a different way. But these are all things we learn. It's very important if we want to be inclusive in our research and to do this global and comparative research. Peter talked about the ethics, and you need to think about not just ethics when reporting findings and when you're disseminating the information, but you need to think about it when you're collecting the data. You need to think about it with the participants and your colleagues. And so, if people don't want to open up about certain things that you're talking about, then you need to feel comfortable with letting that go. And sometimes it's hard. And, I gave the example of me interjecting and saying the librarian to a young man who was talking about the lady in the library. And he corrected me. No, to him, this was the lady in the library, and don't put words into my mouth. And so these are things that we really do have to remember. I think you also, I'm going to go back to this detours, be open, because we were, and think about gender and age. These are other things to think about. Because we were doing focus group interviews, and we happened to have a group of, at the time, they were 12 to 14-year-olds. And one group, we almost did not even include them. And so we interviewed the individuals in this group, and afterwards, and I wasn't there, it was my colleague and some doctoral students, and she called me immediately after and said, oh my goodness, I'm going to send you this recording. You have got to listen to this. They have such a different perspective, and it's some things we never even considered. And she said, we're going to have to change the research plan. And we're going to, we only had so much money. It was grant funded, externally funded. She said, we are getting saturation in these other groups. We need to drop a couple of those and pick up more of individuals in this age group and this point in their lives. And, I was telling Debbie at lunch, we got so many papers out of that because it was interesting. They weren't overstudied and they were different. Their perspectives were different. But if my colleague hadn't had the wherewithal to say, whoa, stop. This wasn't in the plan, but it needs to be, we wouldn't have gotten that. And so be very open about all of these things. The whole connect the problem and the findings to the current environment, that came up this morning too. And I really like that. And I think that's when Peter may have said that, so what? And I think that's really important. What's happening today that makes this important? And you need to look at that globally, not just in your own little world. And that really puts the findings into perspective and gives you that answer to so what. Another thing that kept coming up today was acknowledge the limitations. And I heard them whenever Christina, Egbert, and Debbie were talking. They were saying, well, we may have done something this way, or in hindsight, and we do that a lot, and that's okay. but acknowledge that so that others can learn from that. I think, sorry, I'm picking on all my colleagues in the room. They'll never talk to me again at lunch or dinner. But Debbie was talking about her dissertation and how the phases. And she said, in hindsight, I probably would have changed that order. It still worked, but that's good to know. Let others know, because there are limitations to what we do. And document a future research agenda. And I think that's really important, especially when we're talking about this global perspective, this comparative research. When we were all talking again at dinner, we were talking about how we don't have a lot in this area. But I was looking back, and so it's relatively new. However, when I was sitting here today, I was madly searching names of people and what have they done in the past. And I will get to the first thing I found on the first published article I found on this topic, but I'll hold that to keep you here for a few more minutes. The suspense. And then we need to determine different ways to disseminate the findings. And I'll get more into that again on some future slides here. But we have different ways of disseminating our information. This is one way. In these virtual and hybrid experiences, in our face-to-face, during our lunches, our dinners. These are all ways that we disseminate this information. Different types of meetings in the published record. They're social media. So there are different ways where we can get this information out. TikTok is one in the social media that I've been thinking about a lot. So we need to be creative. Now, this is something from Henry Kissinger, and I'm not promoting his politics, but I did like this. He said, a diamond is a chunk of coal made under pressure. So what does that have to do with this? Well, when you think about the research that we do, often we're under pressure for several different reasons. If it's a funding agency, they expect certain outcomes, outputs, and a timeline. If it's an institution, if it's something that they need for decision-making, you may be on a timeline. It may be your own timeline that you say, I have something else I have to move to. I have to get this finished. Maybe it's from a community that they need to know this. It's timely. We can't take 2 years for this one. I heard today in our breakout group, one of the virtual attendees is working on a doctorate. And I think he said something like, I have to get this done. Yes, you do. As Jane Robbins, who was the director of the graduate program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, told me one day, Lynn, the only good dissertation is a done dissertation. So get it done. So those are another words of wisdom from someone. And so under pressure, sometimes we also think about failure. And I do. And I did a project recently, and it was called the New Model Library. And that project, I thought, was the biggest failure of my career. Why? It wasn't on schedule. It was like herding cats to get everyone on the same page. We wrote this, I thought, a wonderful scholarly report, 104 pages. No one wanted to read it. We had to get that down to 30 pages. And I thought, there's nothing here. What are we going to do? And I had many sleepless nights. I could not tell the team because then they would lose confidence, not just in me, but in themselves and the project. And it was very stressful. But now when we got that 30-page out, you know what? People like it. And it's been something that grows. It wasn't the final product. We're using it for different marketing. We're using it for other projects to hang things on, to move forward. So it was very future forward, although I did not think it was. And so I think we're often harder on ourselves when it comes to these things than others are. So remember, it's not failure. And I say this to the team, they'll say, well, we didn't learn anything. And look, we screwed up when I told you about the diaries and how they did not work. We screwed up, we're done. No, we're not done. We are so lucky. We're in research. We can tell everybody, don't do this. We did it. Do this works better. So don't think in these terms because research can be isolating and difficult. So now what? I'm going back to this. This is very tactical. This is, what did you learn? Now, where do you go from here? You go back to those original steps. Why? Why did we do this? How? What methods were we using? Who worked with us? You had to commit. You collected data, you analyzed the data, you recognized your limitations, you disseminate the findings. Now what? There's that future research. And I think Steve, I think somebody else talked about that, but you, maybe Christina, Debbie, and Egbert. But I think it's also very important for us to think about it for ourselves. What did we learn? I mean, my next big project that I hope to do is to develop a research agenda for public libraries. Now, I don't want to do everything on that agenda. I'd like to pick one or two, but I want it out there so people can think about it and say, hey, Connaway, you're off base here. Did you think of this? Or that doesn't work. But we need to think about the future so that we can be more proactive than reactive. And I think that's extremely important. When Debbie and I were talking at lunch, I said, I wanted on this research agenda, I'd like to, when we're looking at users, I want to go to those 5-year-olds because the research indicates if they're taking up something, a technology, an app, if that's still around, they'll still use it. They'll gradually move to others, but it's dependent upon their peers, their friends. And so if we're watching them and learning what they're doing, when they come into our academic libraries, our school libraries, we're not reacting and go, oh no, they're doing this. What are we going to do? We're saying, oh, we thought they may be doing that. Yes, they'll be taking detours too, but you'll have that plan, that itinerary. And I think that's really important. So this is sort of going back to what Steve was talking about today. It's telling the story. And it needs to be strategic. So you need to, again, answer that why question. Why did you do this? Was it to inform strategic planning? Was it to inform practice? Was it to change what you're doing internally? Was it to develop new theories and frameworks? You need to tell that story. Also, to whom? You need to know your audience. And I think that was my big failure with the new model library project. I was thinking of an academic audience. I was thinking of a book. No, we're thinking of leaders, library leaders, people who don't have a lot of time to read 105 pages. Somebody who wants to have a lot of visuals and bullet points and like, this is what you learned and this is where we should be going. Know your audience. Someone when I was the chair of the Association of College and Research Libraries Value of Academic Libraries Committee. And you can see there's I have the URL at the bottom, much easier than saying this. They always, we used to talk about this a lot and say, think about you're in an elevator with your university president or rector or vice rector, and you have like 2 minutes. What are you gonna say to get that person excited about what you're doing? Have that in your back pocket at all times. If it's your library director, if it's even a colleague, a faculty member, somebody in your community, have that in your back pocket. Just one little tidbit to get them excited. You may have to have different ones for different people, but make sure you have something that you can say and be excited about and get them excited about. How are you going to do this? Well, I did say that presentations, reports, visualizations, and social media. I know we're getting much better within the profession of using social media. I know a lot of us use Facebook. I'm on Facebook, but they were telling me when we were interviewing users, and I think this was 2012, Facebook is for old people. So that was what, 10 years ago? So it's great for all of us, many of us, to keep into contact with each other, family, but we need to be reaching out. There are all of these other things that I see young people using that I have no clue. My 14-year-old niece is a great baker. And I said, how did you learn to do that? And she would say, TikTok. And then I'd say, she cut a watermelon like this. I said, where did you learn that? TikTok. So I said, send me the link. So I went in, well, I had to keep stopping it. They're fast. And to watch that. But we need to be thinking in these terms. What's quick? What's fast? What will get our point out there? So it's a very different way for me personally to think and to act. But I'm trying to condition myself to be more open. Again, this is being more inclusive, being more global, thinking in terms of how others are living their lives. So where do we go from here? Well, I hate to say it, and I think, this came out yesterday, and with Peter's presentation and Christina, Debbie, and Egbert's presentation, we have a lot of work to do in the area of global and comparative research design. However, when people probably thought I was reading my emails or checking the train schedule, I was trying to figure out when in library and information science we started talking about this. And I saw that John F. Harvey, who was the Dean of Library Services at the University of New Mexico, published a paper in 1973. And it was called Towards a Definition of International and Comparative Library Science. And it was in a journal called International Library Review. So this was 1973. Then I found Miles Jackson. He was at the University of Hawaii. He was the Dean of the Information and Library Science program. And in 1982, he published an article in the International Library Review Journal. So I said, Peter, when did you start thinking and doing this? And so he said, oh, you told me, go, let's look at my curriculum vitae. And so we did. And it looks like, Peter, maybe around 2008, 2009, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah.
And so really, this isn't new for our discipline or our profession, but it's taking a long time. And I think we talked earlier about having an adoption in social science of theories, frameworks takes 7 to 10 years. This has been a little longer, but we're
Much
making,
longer.
pardon?
Much longer, because there was quite a lot of work done in the 1970s by J. Perriam Danson, for example, and in Britain by the first books on how to do comparative international research were written by Danton and a lady with a Czech surname, which will come back to me in a minute. So that was also all in the early 1980s or late 1970s.
So talk about future research. Maybe we need sort of this history and something on, look, we started talking about this and look what's happening. We have made, I would think, we have made some advances.
There's been a gap. There's been a huge gap during which nothing much actually happened in terms of the conceptualization of the field. A huge gap.
And so, and how do you feel now? Do you think we're moving back towards integrating that?
What we're doing today, I think, is an indication that yes, we can. There's still a huge amount of interesting stuff to do, and we're getting to develop the tools to do it.
So I think that's promising, but I really think I struggled with the word infancy because it has been around for a while, but maybe it's more of that infancy of implementation. I don't know, but pardon?
Gerontology.
I'm not putting that on my slide.
Maybe reincarnation.
Reincarnation is better.
That's better. But I think, again, we really need to consider all of the things we've talked about in these 2 days for how we are going to move forward. I think, again, disseminating the findings, articulating the limitations, and then coming up with this future research. And what we heard yesterday from Christina, Debbie, and Egbert made me think about a lot of different things we could be doing. And I'm really looking forward to what they write about this, because they can address a lot of things that will help us as we do move forward. Because as they talked about things, I mean, they were pretty open about this was difficult. These are things maybe we would have thought about differently. And so, and also having collaborators is extremely helpful and important. My mother always said, misery loves company. And so it's always great to have someone with you in those down times. It's always great to have them with you at the up, but it's really good to have them with you when you're just not sure what you're doing or you're feeling you're not making a difference. I think we need to continue to develop this global and comparative research design, and I hope we can do that and continue to do that. It can be difficult because it's difficult to deal with different ways of thinking. And in many ways, that's what we're talking about. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of working. It's a different way of sharing and writing. When I was in Spain for a year, working with colleagues, and the Spanish lifestyle is very different than what I was used to in the US. And at first I was thinking, what's going on? I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that. And then when I let go and lived that life and worked with them, we were very productive. And I would move to Spain in a minute. It's a wonderful way to think, to live, and to work. We talked about things, we did accomplish things, but it wasn't in the way I was used to in the US. And so it was a great learning experience for me and a very difficult time for me in many aspects. But I think in the long run, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me because I did learn to do these things differently. And I think it's a learning process as well. And so Neil Armstrong, who was an astronaut, he said, research is creating knowledge. And in many ways it is. And I'm not gonna get into the, what is information, what is knowledge? Yeah. I'm not gonna go there today. That can be another time. But I really think that is, and when you take those few words, that's not easy. That's very difficult. And so I'm going to stop and open it up so that I can hear from all of you about your experiences today. I think we have about a half an hour, is that it? But we don't have to use the half an hour. But I just would like to hear from those who have joined us virtually, I think 11 or so, or no?
About that.
And those of us in the room. Anything to add? Oh, Becky.
I have a question about open data, which I know hasn't been a topic that we've covered, but in terms of when you're producing your research, say, for example, a set of interview transcripts, say the transcripts from your study or the summaries of those transcripts, at what point in the process should you be deciding that this data is going to be open, and how does that impact on the ethics process and informed consent? Sorry, there was quite a lot there.
Well, and I know that others can jump in, but for us, it's part of the information that we submit for the ethics committee or the institutional review boards, whatever you may call that. That's all part of it. And there's certain, and for federal grants in the US, it's the same thing. We have to say how we're going to make them open, if we're going to make them open, and how you're going to anonymize. And you have to we had to include that in our consent forms for participants, but I'll let others, Debbie, Christina.
I can jump in. I think there is a phrase, and it's one of the European Union documents about open data, is that it is as open as you can and as close as you need, because needed. Because I think with qualitative data, I think quantitative data is much easier. I think you can share it. With qualitative data, it's very difficult. I don't think, frankly, when you are asking us that we'll be sharing the transcript in open access, because there is a lot of identifying information. Our participants are talking about their schools, their programs. You can identify them. The LIS programs are not that huge, that you have 5 to 10 faculty, and who teaches research methods. You can identify them. So I don't think we will share the transcript. However, maybe the summaries that Debbie did, that just kind of synthesize as we remove identifying information from that could be shared. We will share the code book and all the instruments that we use. So it's part of that. It's not really the actual data, but it's the instrumentation sort of showing how this was done. But with qualitative data, I don't think it's actually possible to share it, frankly.
So this brings me to another question then. So in terms of LIS and qualitative data, are we not at a point where we're taking open approaches of it, because like in some fields, there is a massive push towards open data and reuse of data because of the cost that goes into producing research. So as a discipline, are we more reluctant to go open, considering we promote open access and all that kind of thing?
We anonymize all of our transcripts, and even before we have the coder, like before we code, we have 1 or 2 people who just anonymize everything. And so if somebody mentions an institution, we'll just put in brackets institutional name or something. And we've done thousands of interviews, and the only data we have shared were transcripts from virtual reference, but they were anonymized as well. And so with all the projects I've been involved with, those were the only data that we collected, and they have been used quite heavily. I will say that. And whoever requests them, they have to agree to certain terms and things like that. But the librarians who we worked with, the library staff, were very concerned that these transcripts could be, if they were identified, could be used against them. If people didn't, higher ups thought they weren't answering the questions the way they wanted them to, or representing the institution the way. So we were very, very concerned about that and took that into consideration. And so they got to see the samples to make sure that they were okay with that. But we did remove a lot of data. I don't see us putting all of our interview data out there either. And I see people nodding. And I don't think that's going against open. Debbie?
No, this really does go back to that, the ethical use of personal information. And, yes, we're entirely happy to be sharing the quantitative data. But the qualitative data is so contextual and situational, you can follow methods and methodologies and methods. You can reuse questionnaires, this is the value of that, as opposed to, and the code books, and you can actually analyze those pieces. But the potential harm to an individual, as Lynn was saying, and this is based on, historical fact of people's the persistent use of people's personal information, and not to their benefit, and how people have had to fight quite hard to get certain not just personal information, but biological matter removed from that open science, for example. So, but if we can share everything else, then, and we describe how we're doing everything, then we are allowing others to very easily replicate or, contrast and critique what we're doing, because it's also about the critique aspect.
Another thing, as Debbie had said, is about the critique, because most of our colleagues were coordinator of LIS schools, college, faculty, and I think that will bring them in a lot of trouble if we could share those kind. It's very good to share all the other way of doing things, but here it's a very, very personal and institutional matter that I think that we couldn't allow to open them.
No. And I agree, like we put out all of our data collection tools. So we have interview protocols, we have surveys, we have code books. We make all of that available. And I love reading, reading people's code books, because that tells you a lot about the research. And I wonder if I should someday do a study about code books, because they really are revealing. I think they're interesting in themselves. So, are there questions online?
There are several comments online. The comments are expressing their great thanks for your presentation and the other presentations, and really a nice feeling of generating a group and community of scholars that are concerned with this area. So hopefully we're able to use this as a start to reincarnate.
Reincarnation.
I had a similar kind of comment going back to your original question about reflecting on this experience. And I already sent out a tweet about it, but I've been very inspired and also overwhelmed by this. I said, I think this is the kind of experience that, at least for a couple months, will make me honor those blocks on my Fridays for my research days, but to have a chance, kind of as somebody who's relatively new to this field, to have a chance to sit in a room and discuss ideas and concepts with individuals who literally wrote the book on some of the various aspects of my subdiscipline is an amazing opportunity. And I think, there's a a cyclical kind of aspect of global and comparative librarianship that has kind of gone forward. I really liked your second to last slide about, where we're going from here. If I can quote from Peter's book, because I wrote it in my tenure letter. Yeah, he says, if this book is indeed a summarization of the discipline, I would like to think it a summation, not of the end of the field, but of the end of a phase that will be followed by a phase of renewed and more informed interest in an expanding and evolving field. And when this was announced, and I had to try to rearrange my travel schedule, I said, no, I have to be there for this because I see this as a jumping point for that new phase. So kudos to all of you who put this together and brought us all together. It's great.
Thank you.
very much.
Yeah, I did nothing. It was the others in the room here.
All I did was send
Did a
emails.
lot.
So.
And Ellen.
Thank Ellen.
Ellen has been so organized. So, anyone else want to say anything before we go? Because Peter, Egbert, Debbie, Christina.
Well, the question is for Steve. Where do we go from here?
That's an excellent question. We've talked a little bit in, sidebar conversations, I think. It would be interesting to kind of try to take a next step, in trying to create a community around this area of research. First, maybe create an informal group that's communicating regularly, but maybe try to organize a symposium that's more not the meta research that we've been having discussions on, but of people sharing the research and the work that they're doing and the ongoing work and trying to get a group together. So I think our first step is to reach out to those who registered and showed interest in the workshop, whether they were here in person or virtually, and see if they would be willing to have their information shared, and then think about a future symposium. It could be, I don't want to say an IFLA satellite, because I just said I'm never going to organize one of these again. But something like that. So.
Did someone else organize?
Someone else.
Christina, did you want to add
No,
anything?
no.
No? Anyone? Oh, Debbie.
I think it would be interesting to talk about, as Peter had raised a question about what we might or might not have discovered about decolonizing practices and the concept of reflexive research practices and how we might be able to evolve our research practices in a different way and less of us directing the research and more of our participants who are involved in the research directing that in that wonderful world of discovery. So I think there are lots of conversations we can have, and it'll be interesting to see what we can gather, especially as we're talking about global and the implications of what that means.
Yeah, and that whole the community-based, community participative research, that whole area is really quite interesting.
As is the whole field of transnational phenomena in LIS, which is growing, it's mushrooming in our time.
And I think we don't have any lack of interest or subjects to pursue. I think we just have to think about, again, what's the purpose? What do we want to know? And I think, everything is incremental steps, which often I learned in public policy. It's often very frustrating for some of us. We want to go from here to there very quickly, but that's not how things usually work. And so if we all of us start thinking about this and the incremental steps that we need to take to move this forward, I think we can make a big difference. Ellen, did you have anything to add?
Well, I suppose I've just been thinking, it's just been an absolute pleasure to have you all here in this room in DCU, and we're delighted that you picked us to host the conference, and I've learned so much over the last 2 days. It's been invaluable, so thank you so much.
And are there any other questions online, or are we?
No, just people want to be kept in the loop as they.
Good. Was it, I think then we can say that we're
Officially?
Yeah, we're officially closed. So thank you very much,
Thanks,
colleagues who are
everyone.
online. And we hope to see you again another time online or in person. Thank you. Goodbye.